Welcome to the Kid Men Podcast with Dr. Val and Dr. Virginia, where we talk about everything kid men.
And pull back the curtain on some of the surprises and challenges in children's ministry that nobody prepares you for.
I'm Dr. Val, and together we have over 45 years of experience in children's ministry.
I'm Dr. Virginia. Valerie and I met over 10 years ago in our doctoral program at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. We are excited to share with you all the great stuff that we have picked up over the years. We want to minister to you, the children's minister.
Welcome, friends. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Last week, we began a conversation with Angela Lewton, who is a children's ministry safety and security expert with KidCheck. She began sharing with us about emergency policies, emergency response plans. And so she had so much wonderful information to share. We have split that up into 2 episodes. This is our second portion of our information about emergency response plans.
My last one is health and behavioral emergencies, because we do see more and more of this anytime you turn on the television. And I would actually put an active shooter scenario within this bucket because, it's more on the health and behavioral side. So with those, what's really important for these types of emergencies is that your staff is well trained. I know that oftentimes the Red Cross will offer CPR classes for those who want to learn infant CPR as well as, pediatric CPR. And so having a trained staff in these scenarios is really important. And also being connected with your security team is even more important for these types of scenarios, because they can be a buffer between you and the situation. Probably a lot better than anyone else could be a buffer for you. Right. So with these types of scenarios, it's just really important to make sure that you have your first aid kits well identified, your contact lists for first response. I think at the end of this, we're going to be providing a link to a printout for an emergency instructions flipbook.
Oh,
and
great.
That's really helpful because everything is encapsulated in many different scenarios and it hangs right on your wall. And so you just want to make sure that your staff is trained. They know who to call, who to contact, who to reach out to. Oftentimes those scenarios, whether it's a heart attack or a seizure or an allergic reaction with a child, those come on pretty fast.
Right.
So I always encourage ministries to make sure that everyone is identified externally, whether it's a tag that is what we call a guardian tag that has this child, medical information, allergies. A lot of times there's no contact orders. There are things where there is an unauthorized guardian that should not be picking up the child. Right. Having that information readily available for people to see, not that it screams it out, but to have some sort of a way for teachers to be able to understand the nuances of a child in that scenario. There recently, I think it was last year, there was I think it was a daycare, and a little boy was allergic to dairy. And it was a new staff member that had come in, and he always wanted to eat dairy, and they always told him, you can't have it, you're allergic to it. And that particular day, where they had a new staff member at the daycare, the boy ate some dairy, and he ended up going anaphylactic. And the new volunteer or staff member was not able to address the situation. She had no idea what to do. And so, unfortunately, the little boy lost his life. And it takes those types of scenarios for people to understand that it's seconds, and you need to know how to respond to that. And so on the health side, those are really, really important for everyone to be trained on. And then if everybody can't be trained in CPR, or make sure they know exactly where the first aid kit is. Make sure that they know who to call. Make sure that they can get first response in there easily and get them out easily.
Right.
That's also scenarios we've heard happening where, ambulance fire will come in and doors are blocked or doors are locked and they can't get in and they can't figure out where they're supposed to go. And so it's really important. And we always recommend, if you can, allow them to train on your
Right.
campus, allow them
Right.
on, get connected with your local resources because they have so much information.
They
And
really do, and they want to be helpful. I have found anytime that I've contacted like a local fire hall or the police department for the area that I was in, they were always more than welcome to come to the building to help walk through things because they want to know the plans too, because they need to know what to do if they need to respond to an emergency in your building. And typically, if you don't have a weekday program, you don't have that automatic check that happens every so often that, I know that the fire departments are supposed to check on a regular basis all the churches in the area, but they don't typically unless there is a need for it, like with a weekday. And so I think having that relationship with the local law enforcement and fire and emergency personnel is so helpful.
absolutely. And they are, I think one person shared last year that they reached out to their local police department or sheriff's department when they had VBS.
Right.
Because they were short on volunteers and they knew that they needed additional external security. So they called them and they said, hey, we've got a VBS taking place. We're going to have a lot of kids. We're short on volunteers. Is it possible to have somebody drive by and just kind of keep an eye on? We'll be outside. They were more than willing to say, absolutely. You know what? We'll put a few people on that and they're willing to work with you.
Right.
And it makes their job a lot easier
Yeah, it
too.
really does.
So, I'm not an expert on active shooter, but I know that there are some complexities there for putting together an emergency action plan. Like I mentioned earlier on, the complexities are with some facilities, it's better to hide and shelter in place. And in other facilities, it's better to evacuate safely everyone. And a lot of it depends on the scenario.
Right.
But those are the types of things that law enforcement can help. They train on that all the time. They train together on it. And so, especially an organization that's dedicated to kids and youth, I believe they would absolutely come in and say, let's figure this out. How are we going to put an emergency action plan? What does that look like? What are you looking for from us? What do you need to learn to do? So leveraging those local resources for scenarios like that are more complex are really helpful. And really, none of us are really going to have the knowledge that they do in terms of putting together that action plan on, and so I just really encourage that. And especially for active shooter, there's just been, there's been a lot of discussion about it and it's not fun, but it is something that people need to be aware of. Do the doors lock? Can they keep the kids in the room? Can they hide them somewhere? Is that the best? Or should they evacuate? What does it look like? So having those conversations all the time with volunteers and staff, that's really the big thing with those types of scenarios. So
yeah. And I find that it's so interesting because whenever I've done walkthroughs with children's ministers in buildings for safety and security things, again, because a church building is typically not used every single day, and because they don't typically have people that come through and check, having that extra set of eyes to walk through the building, I think is so important because I was always amazed at how many buildings, like, for example, would have chains and padlocks on a random door or would have certain areas that were blocked off by certain things because, well, we just never use that area when, when actually it would be an area of egress if there was an emergency. And it's like, but if it's padlocked without a key, somebody's not going to be able to get out. So it's those kinds of things that typically will happen in a large building that you don't expect you wouldn't think would happen, but people do tend to like, we don't want anybody to come in this door, so let's padlock it. But they don't think, well, now we can't get out the door.
Out the door. Yeah.
And so, so having that extra set of eyes to come through to kind of say, have you thought about the fact that, how would you get out this door if you needed to, or what would you do here in this situation?
And it's even more difficult with kids.
Right.
Because if you can't get out the door, then you've got to reroute, children and possibly put them in harm's way. And so, I think that's such a great point, is walking through and allowing another set of eyes. And those are what we call safety gaps. Those would be something when you walk by it 100 times, you don't really think about it.
Mhm.
But when you actually are in a scenario of emergency, you need that door to be able to open.
Right.
And I think it's interesting too, what we're seeing on a lot of campuses are automatic doors that lock.
Mhm.
And so where is that actually controlled? Is that controlled in a specific part of the campus? What happens if there's a fire? Do the doors all automatically unlock? Who controls that?
Right.
Understanding those details of building safety are really important. And, but people just they don't think about them very often.
Right.
So it's great that you're educating them on, look at those details, because they can make the difference of, a tragedy versus, just an emergency going like yours did, smoothly, where everyone gets out safely and it's very easy. Okay, well, that's what I have for those types of things. But I did want to quickly touch on some of the similar components that you'll find in an EAP. So we talked about the uniqueness of every organization and the complexities of some things. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what the similar components will be, what you should find in every EAP. And there's quite a list, but I'll try to get through it quickly. The first one we've already sort of talked about is the routes, the escape plans, the building and facility layout, the design of it, really making sure that you have that captured somewhere in your EAP, whether it's a picture or an actual map of your facility. Making sure that that is always included is one of the most important things, because from there, you can really sort of build your scenarios based on that design and just the outlets, what's outside of your campus, parking lots, tennis courts, parks, what exists out there. So having that map of the area is really, really important. The incident reporting process. So how will you actually report to your first response teams in your local? Who will make the call? What numbers will be dialed? Do you have a contact? Is that your security team, or is that you? So having that incident reporting process outlined in your EAP for a specific emergency is really helpful as well. Alerting staff. How does that happen? If everybody's in rooms with closed doors, or I'm not sure how what your scenario was when you experienced your fire, but how did you alert? I mean, you said for people in the church, you literally ran out of the building and said, this is not a drill. This is an actual fire, So how do you alert staff and volunteers and people who are on other parts of the campus? Having that process outlined and what it looks like is really important. And oftentimes, when you're in it, it can change, obviously.
Right.
But, do you have a chain where you let the kindergarten teacher know, who lets the first grade teacher know?
Right.
So just having that process outlined. And then how do you communicate with families when there is an emergency? How will they find out? Will it be via text? Will it be an email? Will it be a phone call? How do you alert them? How do you let them know their child is safe? Because what do we all want to do when we hear that there's an emergency where our children are? Boom, we all want to go towards it, which sometimes makes things harder in terms of the response. So making sure that parents understand and staff understands and volunteers how everybody's going to be communicated with is a really important thing. Training. What is that going to look like? Having a training plan for emergency response is really important. And I think that's unique to every organization. Sometimes they'll do, training once a month. You can, introduce your booklet, or what I've seen work even better is what we call a 10-minute standing meeting each week, where in your staff or when you have all of your volunteers and staff together, you're going over a procedure, you're going over an emergency response, policy, and you just keep repeating them each, you just roll through them. And I found that those 10-minute meetings are really helpful because you can spend the first 5 talking about the policy or the procedure, and then you can spend the last 5 taking questions. And if you have a list that you just need to go over, just do it each week. And slowly but surely, you just give them the information. And then you can use the big trainings for maybe when people come in from the outside. So your local first responders do your big trainings, get people, more comfortable with the facility and exiting and managing chaos from the response side. But, you can do what is best for people. But I found smaller chunks of information over periods of time. That's what sticks. At least that's what sticks for me.
Right.
So that's the other thing that needs to be done. And then, a way to account for people. Of course, I work for KidCheck, and most people look at check-in as, attendance tracking, but there's so much more to it than just that. But how are you going to account for people, not only children, but also your volunteers and also your teachers? Everybody responds differently to emergency. So, what does that look like? And how are you going to account for those people? And that process, have that outlined in your EAP. Because I think it's helpful too for people to know, okay, when an emergency happens, this is what's going to happen to me.
Right.
That is a big deal when you know what's going to happen. There's no surprises there. You're already surprised by the emergency, but knowing the process behind it, that's really important as well.
I think when you're looking at church ministry, the thing that is so unique is that we often have leaders that aren't typically there every single Sunday. We either have volunteers that rotate, or maybe we have volunteers that are coming in to fill in for people who aren't there. And so the idea that it's different from, say, a school classroom situation where the teachers know all of their kids, they know all of their names, they are super familiar with the procedures. We have groups that are coming in and out so regularly that it makes it harder to be as familiar. So having those things like what you provide through KidCheck to be able to have those attendance lists so that, teachers will have that list of the names of the kids that are there and be familiar with them. And then to have people like hall directors in place that are there every week, that aren't in the classroom, but can be there to help those volunteers that are newer. And so that they're familiar with the procedures when something happens.
Absolutely. I think that there is and I know that this is not possible for every ministry, but there's a huge safety advantage when we're talking about using technology, even just with the walkie-talkies. That's considered a technology.
Right.
But having the ability to have your information that allows you to make decisions in stressful situations mobile is a big safety advantage. And not just for the person in the classroom, but also exactly what you said, the hall monitors, the security team. There's also those scenarios where you have a special needs class. Do you have the materials that you need, the resources to evacuate those kids? What if there are children with oxygen, if there are children with, apparatus that come with them? How are you going to account for those? How do you get those out? And technology helps because you can keep track of everybody. We do have one case study that's fascinating out I believe it's on the KidCheck website, and it was a church in Virginia, and they actually had a very large special needs ministry. And they had one security team member that was dedicated to just that part of the ministry.
Nice.
And they had, we have an admin console app, which is essentially taking your entire traditional check-in station and putting it on your phone. And that security person had access to that. So they knew what children were within the special needs ministry. They knew their particular requirements for, just throughout their time there.
Right.
And they had them in an area where they could evacuate them easily.
Right.
But it was bringing that security person in with that information that was so helpful to them.
Right.
And that's just a case in point on, there's just security advantages when we're talking about mobility of information. It's hard if you don't have a live roster list that is like, okay, I've got this on my phone. I know my 20 students are here. Everyone's accounted for. And we do have a roster check-in, which is a live list that's customizable. And so those types of things are always just so helpful in these types of scenarios.
And that was one of the things for us with our special needs ministry for for Sunday morning. We actually had a rotation schedule of our deacons where we had 2 deacons that's just literally their job was just to stand outside of the special needs classroom. And that was what they were there for. They were there if there was an emergency, if we needed to evacuate. They were trained and they just knew that their job was just to be there if there was an emergency. And they just actually rotated each Sunday. And so they didn't have any other responsibility than to just stand outside the door and they, in case we needed them. And so it's having those little things in place ahead of time, just in case, because we knew if something happened, we were going to need help to evacuate that room. So
it's true. And, having that information in your emergency response plan or in your emergency action plan is really important, because then everybody knows what is the equipment that's going to be needed. Is there a separate exit that actually should be used just for special needs? But it's those types of details that you want to put in every single one and just stay consistent with it. I love that. I love that you're utilizing and leveraging the deacons for that type of support. I feel like oftentimes we've got support within our ministries, but we just don't see it. And so it's great to see somebody utilizing those to say, you're dedicated today to special needs ministry. Whatever they need, if there's an emergency, you're the guys that are going to be, helping with that. That's a great use of your resources, I think. So I think that's everything that I have, all 7 points that need to be on the emergency action plan, but additional resources. So that's really important for people to know, where do I find resources? And we've talked a lot about them. Of course, there are websites, local county.gov sites that give specific emergency response information for your local area. Those are always a great one. Knowing your local resources, police, fire, leveraging their expertise and knowledge to help you create the plans that will most readily affect you. Also, there are resources, like we've got a tremendous amount of information on the KidCheck blog about creating an emergency response plan or an emergency action plan. That's also there. And you don't have to be a customer of ours to use that. We provide that for ministries as value add. And so you always have a place to go if you need something with regards to child protection and safety, and you don't really know where to look. We just encourage people to look there. So there's all kinds of resources out there. And we're giving the link to the emergency flip book, which is a big one, because I will tell you, if you print that, I can't ever remember the name of it, but it's a waterproof paper and you can get it on Amazon. But if you print that flip book on waterproof paper, it hangs perfectly by a door in a hallway, But with it being waterproof, even if you get stuff on it, you just wipe it off. And it's customizable. So you can put all of
Right.
your numbers, your information in there.
Mhm.
And so it's a really good resource. So those are some additional resources that people can use. Googling just how to create an emergency action plan, you'll see just a whole bunch of stuff come up because everybody knows how important it is for organizations.
We
So
love that because Virginia and I are big on don't reinvent the wheel.
Amen.
If you can look at a guide, if you can find something that can be adjusted with your information, it's just those kinds of things are so helpful.
absolutely. And I love that. That should be a life motto. Do not, no reason to reinvent the wheel. Yes.
No reason.
So I hope that people will, be able to find information. And specifically, I think your local resources are always really good, especially those .gov sites on the county side. They do a lot. And FEMA has a tremendous amount of information. So there's no lack of information out there. And but you're right. Don't reinvent the wheel. Find examples of what people are doing and leverage those. I'm sure everybody's happy to help and share because
Right.
it can be daunting.
It is.
So you've shared so much wonderful information about creating these emergency plans. What are just some week-to-week ministry practices that we can have to make things easier on ourselves if an emergency does crop up?
That's a great question because I think there are some things we can do, just little things that help take the load off every week. We've already talked a lot about really setting up a training and education plan. That's a really important part. But an even bigger part of that is having a child protection policy in place. And that also is a very large piece of your overall safety plan and another big bucket item. But having those procedures either updated or specific to your organization is really helpful because it just minimizes the gray area of interacting with kids. Puts everybody on the same page. Everybody knows what are your bathroom procedures? Do you follow the rule of twos? What are classroom ratios? What do those look like? That's a huge one, especially with emergency response. Do you have the correct classroom ratios? Enough resources within your ministry to support if there was an emergency? That child protection policy has all of these policies and procedures. And so making sure that you're not only training on the emergency action stuff, but you're also training on those policies each week as well. Whether you alternate and do, here's our bathroom procedures, or, here's our check-in and check-out process. Here's how, even if you're not using an electronic solution, you should have something in place to ensure that children are being released to those who are authorized to pick them up. And so whatever that looks like for your ministry, make sure that you're training on that. Everybody knows about that. Everybody's educated. Identification is another big one. So whether you're using guardian tags, as we call them, for the children, all of your volunteers having some sort of a designation, whether it's a lanyard, so that when people look, they know exactly what that person's role is really important and helpful too. The other thing that I would always say is that you're creating a culture that is what we call in our world speak up culture. So you're creating an environment where people, if they see something, no matter how small or large, they feel they can say something.
Right.
Having those open door policies, that's the biggest thing. After an incident occurs, the first response is always, oh, there were no red flags. There were no red flags. But then you start asking more questions and you start sort of stepping through a timeline, and all of a sudden there are red flag, red flag, red flag, red flag that people saw but didn't feel comfortable saying or mentioning to someone, but creating that culture, that environment where you can speak up. We're all here to protect the children, is really important. And you can't be everywhere at once. you can't see everything that's going on in your ministry, no matter how small or large. And so you want to empower people, with the knowledge of your procedures and your policies, and encourage them. If you see something outside of those, please bring it to my attention.
Right.
It's the biggest thing we face oftentimes in ministry is nobody wants to upset the apple cart. Nobody wants to say anything.
Right.
When if somebody would have just said something,
Right.
it would really be helpful. So I know that's a lot. To take in, and I could go on for days about all those policies, but those in particular, the ones that I mentioned, I think are the ones that will help you, because it also helps you to leverage your volunteers,
Mhm.
because you can't do everything as a children's
No, you
director.
can't.
You have, and I struggle with delegation. I'm sure other people struggle with delegation. I'm sure it's an ongoing theme for a lot of us who have a lot of responsibility, but being able to really delegate some of those things is helpful, especially on the safety and security side.
Right.
And then one thing that I don't often mention, but I think is really important,
Mhm.
is no matter how small or large your ministry is, considering a safety committee.
Yes.
It seems so simple, but yet people don't approach it as, this could really help me.
Right.
Whether you have 2 people or 5 people, having a safety committee that's responsible for reviewing your policies and procedures, updating them if things change, educating. Maybe they're the ones that help with training or schedule training. That safety committee doesn't have to be large and bureaucratic. It can be small and flexible and nimble and help you as a director to really make your environment safer, improve child safety. So,
Well, it doesn't all fall on your shoulders so much then too,
Right.
because it's not just I'm saying that this needs to be done. It becomes, this group has come together and reviewed everything, and then we've made decisions that this has to be done. And so, because we've talked a lot about, people are often told when you come into ministry, don't change anything for the first year. But I've always told children's ministers that doesn't count for safety and security, because that is something that has to be addressed very quickly.
Yeah.
And so if you're coming into a new place, having a group of people that can help you review everything and then set things off to begin with is going to be a huge support for you, because it's not just the new person coming in and changing everything. It's a group that, has worked together to make the ministry safe.
absolutely. And can you imagine being a 23 or 24-year-old person coming into a new ministry position and having to convince leadership and board and, all of these people that you need to improve child safety? It's asking.
Daunting.
It is. And it puts a pit in my stomach. So I think by having that support team and include parents, there is nothing wrong with asking a parent if they would sit on your safety committee team.
Right.
They don't have to be people that are directly working for the church or house of worship. They can be a parent that has an interest in just improving child safety.
Right.
But it just seems so easy to me, but sometimes it can be a little more challenging to pull those together, but they're worth the investment of time.
Right.
And especially as you mentioned, so many churches have, you'll have, police officers or firemen or EMT or people like that already within your congregation who more than likely would be happy to use this area of their expertise to benefit their church. So, and then again, it's not just you saying it, it's Deacon Bill, who's also a fireman, or, whoever who's also a police officer. And so, yeah.
And I always encourage people to track the numbers so that when you go into a leadership meeting, you can actually present information to say, we went from screening 20% of our volunteers to 100% of our volunteers. It's not just the people that are directly working with children now. We're screening everybody that's around them. and have those metrics, have those numbers to be able to say,
Right.
this is what I'm doing to improve child safety. And being aware of the actual layout of
Mhm.
why child safety is so important. I mean, screening, which is a whole nother conversation, that is, we're never going to eliminate 100% of abuse.
Right.
We're just not going to do that. But if we take a comprehensive approach to actually screening people, and that includes multiple steps, some things that weren't around 5 years ago, social media check is a good example.
Right.
For those that are around children, are you checking their social media accounts? Are they,
Right.
that's a big one that we see oftentimes today. A lot of younger people live out loud, and you want to make sure that there's a value match there in terms of what's being posted and what's happening. So that's one thing in screening that wasn't around even
Mhm.
3 years ago, and now
Right.
it's like part of the application process. There's just so many things, but screening is just a huge part of it, but you can't do it all by
Right.
yourself.
No.
So you got to get your generals in line to help you. Where's my safety committee? Can they help me with screening? Can they help me with policy, procedure, implementation, education? All these things. I hope people will take away from our conversation that they probably have more access to resources than they even realize.
Right.
And but for ministry directors to be able to state your position to leadership on, this is what I'm doing by the numbers in terms of improving child safety, goes a long way to getting the support that's needed.
So where can we find some of these resources that you've been sharing with us? You've shared, kind of mentioned some different blog posts and things. How do we find some of these resources you've mentioned from
Great
KidCheck?
question.
Yeah.
Anyone can visit KidCheck.com. And out there, you'll find our blog, which has a tremendous amount of child protection and safety information. But on our homepage of KidCheck.com, down towards the bottom, there are a multitude of free safety resources. We have the emergency instructions flipbook that is available. We actually just released an ebook this week that pretty much encapsulates all of the high points of, it's called Optimizing Child Safety in Your Organization.
Oh, nice.
So we now have that complimentary ebook out there for you.
Yeah.
There are video series for training. There is a tremendous amount of case studies. If you want to see creative ways that other organizations are utilizing check-in to help their kids area run more efficiently or manage more communication with parents and volunteers and family, that's all out there as well. And so, yes, please, and once again, you don't have to be using our solution to have access to that information. There are a lot of people I talk with that aren't KidCheck customers, but leverage all of our safety information for, a starting point for putting together their safety plans. And so, yeah, KidCheck.com, and it's all out there for you.
Great.
Awesome.
And you can find us also on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest. I think we've got a YouTube channel. And so those are all available resources as well.
Well, Angela, we just so appreciate that you spent time with us today and that you're sharing all of your information because, like I said at the start, Virginia and I are so passionate about safety and security for our ministries. And it's something that is just overwhelming when you're trying to look at the big picture. And so for you to be able to take us through smaller bites at a time and things to think through has just been so incredibly helpful. And we just really appreciate you so very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. And I'm so grateful that there are people like you that want to get this information out there to, to everyone. It makes such a difference. And, this is, for those of us who work in this area, it's such a passion, the child protection and safety. And so I want to thank both of you for all the work that you do and the time. It takes a lot of effort to put this kind of content out. So I just appreciate that you're willing to do that for the community. We're grateful. We're grateful to have you.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Dr. Virginia, that was so fun, which I know it's odd to say safety and security is fun, but I do enjoy talking
Yes.
about ways that we can better protect our ministries. And so it was a great conversation with Angela. I was so excited that she could join us today. Friends, as always, we are very grateful that you joined us as well today. We are just so thankful that you take time out of your day to spend with us and to hear our conversations. And we just want to meet you where you are. So again, please subscribe and like and do all the things. Send us messages. Let us know if there's a topic that you would like us to cover. If there's a question that you have that you would like us to answer, we would love to be able to help you in that way. And so we look forward to talking to you again soon. Bye-bye.